Week 5, Part 1. The Last Honest Road. County Cork, March 1847. The weather turned unexpectedly fine. For 4 days the rain held off, and beneath the pale spring sun the hills around Ardra began to show the faintest hint of green. Tiny shoots pushed through the hedgerows. Birds returned to the hawthorns, singing as though the world had forgotten its sorrow. Sean watched them from the roadside. "They don't know," he murmured. Bree looked up. "Know what?" "That we're starving." She followed his gaze to a robin hopping among the branches. "They're only birds." Sean nodded. "I wish I could be one for a day." The robin flew away. The family had begun building what the other wanderers called a scalpeen. It was hardly a shelter at all. Sean cut hazel poles with a burrowed billhook, while Tomas helped drive them into the ground. Together they bent the poles into arches and covered them with furze, sods of earth, and every scrap of old cloth they could find. By evening it stood scarcely 4 feet high. Mary clapped her hands. "It looks like a little house." Sean smiled. "It'll keep some of the wind away." She crawled inside immediately. "It's ours?" "For tonight." Mary's smile faded slightly. "Only tonight?" Sean looked away. "We'll see." No one ever knew how long a scalpeen would be tolerated before some farmer or steward ordered it torn down. Still, for the first time since the eviction, the children would sleep beneath something resembling a roof. That evening, Sean and Breed lay awake listening to Liam breathe. His cough had changed. It no longer came in violent fits. Instead, it was deeper, heavier. Every breath sounded wet. Breed reached across the darkness. "Sean, I'm awake. I don't think it's just the fever." He already knew. "What do you think it is?" "I don't know." Neither did. Doctors belonged to people who could pay them. Morning arrived with a sharp frost. Sean crawled from the scalpeen before the others awoke. He stood quietly watching the road. Another endless procession. Families, widows, old men, children. Some carried sticks, others carried nothing. A woman pushed a wheelbarrow containing her husband. The man sat upright, staring blankly ahead. His legs were wrapped in blankets. They never moved. Sean watched until they disappeared over the hill, and he wondered whether the man was alive. "I'm going back to Cork." Breed had expected it. "You'll find nothing different. I have to try." She looked towards the sleeping children. "I know." Sean crouched beside Mary. She opened her eyes. "Going to work?" "I hope so. Will you bring bread?" He smiled. "If I can." She reached into her pocket. "Take him." She placed the little wooden horse into his hand. Sean frowned. "You keep him. He'll bring you luck." Sean looked at the worn carving. The blue paint had almost vanished. One ear had broken off years before. It was worthless, and more precious than anything else they owned. He slipped it carefully into his pocket. "I'll bring him home." The road into Cork seemed busier than ever. Wagons rolled toward the harbour under armed escort. Each carried heavy sacks stacked almost to the height of the horses. Sean stepped aside as one passed. A tear in the canvas revealed gold grain sprilling from the corner of a sack, only a few kernels. They bounced onto the road. Before the wagon had travelled 20 yards, 3 children threw themselves into the mud. One little girl scooped up the scattered grain with frantic fingers. Another fought her for it. The youngest simply licked the wet road where the kernels had fallen. The guards never looked back. Sean stood frozen. One of the kernels lay near his boot. He bent down, picked it up, rolled it between his fingers. 1 grain, 1 seed, enough to grow a stalk, enough to become dozens more. He closed his hand around it, then placed it carefully into his pocket beside Mary's wooden horse. Work proved even harder to find. The relief works had almost vanished. The stone yards were full. The timber merchants had dismissed men. Even the docks had fewer ships unloading than before. Outside one warehouse, Sean counted nearly 300 men waiting. When the foreman appeared, he needed only 4. He chose the strongest. Sean was not among them. As the crowd dispersed, an elderly labourer touched Sean's sleeve. "First time?" Sean nodded. "It gets easier." "What does?" "Being turned away." The old man smiled without humour. "I don't remember what hope feels like anymore." By noon, Sean had earned nothing. His legs carried him towards the harbour almost without thinking. The smell reached him first. Salt, tar, fish. coal smoke, then grain. He had forgotten what it smelt like, warm, dry, alive. Warehouses lined the quays. Some bore the names of merchants painted in fading letters. Others stood plain and enormous, their doors watched by armed guards. Wagons came and went constantly. Men carried sacks aboard waiting ships. Not one sack was small. Not one looked half empty. Sean watched in disbelief. So much food. Enough to feed every starving family he had passed that morning. Enough to feed half of County Cork, yet it flowed steadily from warehouse to ship as though famine didn't exist. A young dock worker noticed him staring. Never seen grain before, Sean answered quietly. I've grown it. The man shrugged. Not your grain now. No. The words stung. Nearby, against the harbour wall, sat perhaps 50 starving people. They watched the ships exactly as Sean did. No one shouted. No one protested. They simply watched. One old woman crossed herself each time another wagon entered a warehouse. A little boy no older than Mary asked his mother, Can we have some? She pulled him onto her lap. There isn't any for us. Sean wanted to tell the child that there was plenty. It simply belonged to someone else. He remained there nearly an hour, not studying, not planning, simply watching. The guards changed every few hours. The wagons followed roughly the same route. Dock workers entered through one gate and left by another. A bell rang whenever a ship was ready to load. Sean noticed these things without intending to. A farmer notices gates, a labourer notices routines. It was habit. Nothing more, or so he told himself. By late afternoon, hunger drove him back towards the city. Near a narrow lane, he saw a young man collapse. People stepped around him. No one stopped. Not because they lacked compassion, because everyone feared fever. Sean knelt. The man's eyes fluttered open. Water. Sean handed him the last of his own, and the stranger drank greedily. Thank you. Where's your family? The young man stared blankly. Gone. When? I don't know. Sean helped him sit against the wall. There was nothing else he could do. As he walked away, he heard the man whisper, God keep you. Sean wondered who would keep him. When he returned to the Scalpine, the children were waiting. Mary ran towards him. You came back. I promised. She searched behind him hopefully. No bread? Sean shook his head. I'm sorry. Mary smiled anyway. It's all right. He knew she was protecting him. She was only 6. Already she understood disappointment too well. That evening, Tomas arrived carrying a rabbit. A rabbit. The sight of it stunned everyone. Where in God's name? Tomas grinned, snared him. Sean laughed. It was the first genuine laugh Breed had heard from her husband in weeks. The rabbit was small, far too small for 2 families. Still they divided it carefully. Every scrap of meat, every piece of liver, even the bones were cracked later for the marrow. The broth simmered long into the evening. Liam managed 3 small spoonfuls before falling asleep. Mary smiled as though she had eaten a banquet. I'd forgotten meat. So had I, Sean admitted. Long after the children slept, Sean sat outside the Scalpine. The stars shone bright above the silent fields. Breed joined him, wrapping the blanket around both of them. You've something on your mind. He reached into his pocket, and first he removed Mary's little horse. Then, a single grain of barley. He placed it in Breed's palm. She looked at it without understanding. Where? The harbour. She stared at him. 1 grain? It fell from a wagon. She rolled it gently between her fingers. It shouldn't matter so much, no, but it does. Sean nodded. I saw enough grain today to feed every soul on these roads. Breed closed her hand round the tiny seed. For a long time neither spoke. Finally she whispered, You'll go back tomorrow? Yes. For work? Sean looked towards the distant lights of Cork. Yes. It was the truth, mostly, but another truth had quietly taken root beside it. For the first time, Sean wanted to see those warehouses again. Not because he intended to steal, not yet, but because once a man had seen abundance standing beside starvation, he could never quite look away. Week 5, Part 2. The Harbour of Plenty. For 2 more mornings, Sean walked the road to Cork before the sun had climbed over the hills. He left while the children still slept. It was easier that way. Mary wouldn't ask whether he would bring home bread. Liam wouldn't reach out his tiny hand, asking to be carried before Sean had even begun the long walk. Breed always rose to see him off. She never tried to stop him. She simply adjusted the collar of his worn coat, as she had done since the first year of their marriage. It was such an ordinary gesture, one that belonged to another life. "Be careful," she whispered. Sean kissed her forehead. "I'll be back before dark." "You always say that." "Because I always intend to." She managed the faintest smile. "Then I'll believe you." The road into Cork had become strangely familiar. Sean knew where the hedgerows grew thick enough to shelter a family. He knew the fields where farmers tolerated wanderers for a night, and those where they did not. He knew the bends in the road where fever carts sometimes appeared. The first time he had seen one, he could not look. Now he forced himself to. The cart passed slowly, drawn by an old mare. Inside lay 6 bodies covered with rough sacking. Only one small hand remained uncovered, a child's hand, no bigger than Liam's. The driver removed his cap as he passed a roadside cross. Sean did the same. Neither man spoke. By mid-morning he reached Cork once more. The city seemed even more crowded than before. Outside the north gate, a woman sat rocking an infant wrapped in a shawl, and she sang softly, a lullaby. Sean smiled despite himself, and as he drew closer he realized the baby had been dead for hours. The woman continued singing. No one interrupted her. There are griefs too deep for strangers. Near the river, a crowd had gathered outside a modest stone building. Unlike the mission halls, there was no preaching, no hymns, no minister calling people inside. Only a plain wooden sign, Friends Relief Committee. Sean joined the line. The people around him spoke quietly. They're Quakers. They don't ask questions. They don't ask your religion. They just feed you. When his turn came, a grey-haired woman wearing a simple bonnet smiled kindly. "You've walked far." "Aye." "Family?" "My wife and 2 children." She filled a small tin can with warm porridge, then another. "And these." She handed him 4 oatcakes, wrapped in clean cloth. Sean hesitated. "I've nothing to give." "You've already given, thanks. I mean to pay." The woman shook her head gently. "We don't keep accounts." Sean looked at her in confusion. "Why?" Her smile deepened. "Because hunger doesn't." He carried the food home as though it were made of glass. Twice he almost stumbled. Twice he steadied himself before the precious porridge would spill. When Mary saw him approaching, she shouted with excitement, "Ma'am, Dad's carrying something." Breed hurried from the scalpeen. For a moment she simply stared. Porridge? And oatcakes. From where? A Quaker committee. Breed looked surprised. "I've heard of them." So had I. "They asked for nothing?" "Nothing." That evening they ate slowly. Sean insisted Breed take a full share. She protested. He ignored her. For one meal, only one, the children looked almost content. Liam even managed to sit outside the scalpeen watching the sunset. "I can hear birds." "So can I," Sean replied. "They're happy." Sean looked toward the orange sky. "I hope so." The following morning, Liam's fever returned with frightening force. By noon he was barely conscious. Breed soaked a cloth in cool water and laid it across his forehead. Mary sat beside him, holding his hand. "He'll get better." No one answered. Mary looked from one parent to the other. "He will, won't he?" Breed gathered her daughter into her arms. "We're praying he will." Mary frowned. "I prayed yesterday." "So did I." "Then why isn't God listening?" Breed closed her eyes. There was no answer a mother could give. Sean left again for Cork, not because he wished to, because standing beside Liam helplessly was almost unbearable. He searched every warehouse, every yard, every dock, every builder. Nothing. One foreman didn't even allow him to finish speaking. Another pointed silently to a line of nearly 400 men. "You see them?" Sean nodded. "They were here before dawn. I'm willing to wait." "So are they." The foreman walked away. Without quite meaning to, Sean found himself back at the harbour. The tide was low. Ships rested heavily against the quays. Men shouted as cranes swung cargo overhead. Grain wagons rolled steadily through the warehouse gates. Everything moved with the precision of a machine. One guard recognized Sean. "You again." Sean shrugged. "No work?" The guard laughed. "You're not the only one." Sean glanced towards the warehouse doors. "Busy?" "Always." "What's in there?" The guard looked at him as though the answer were obvious. "Grain." "All of it leaving?" "Mostly." Sean nodded thoughtfully. The guard chewed a piece of straw. "You thinking of becoming a dock worker? If they'd have me." "They won't." "No." Sean turned away. The guard never suspected how carefully Sean had noticed the answer. As afternoon faded, the harbour bell rang. Dock workers began loading the final sacks aboard a waiting brig. Sean watched from the seawall. A little girl stood beside him, perhaps 7 years old. Her clothes hung from her like rags. She tugged at her grandmother's sleeve. "Is that ship going to England?" "I expect." "What's in the sacks?" "Food." The child watched another cart unload. "So they'll eat?" "Yes." She thought about that. "What about us?" The old woman didn't answer. She simply pulled the child closer, and Sean looked away. On the walk back, he passed a farmer sowing barley. The sight almost stopped him. Seeds scattered from the man's hand in graceful arcs across the field. Life. New life. Sean remembered doing the very same thing only 2 years before. He remembered believing that every seed promised another harvest. Now each handful looks like treasure thrown upon the wind. He reached the Scalpine after sunset. Mary met him, as always. She no longer asked about bread. Instead, she asked, "Did you find work?" Sean shook his head. "Not today." She accepted it quietly, then reached into his hand. "What's this?" Sean opened his palm. Another single grain of barley. It fell from a wagon. Mary held it carefully. "So tiny it is." "Can people eat it?" "They can." She looked towards Liam sleeping fitfully inside the shelter. Then she asked the question that froze Sean where he stood. "Da?" "Yes." "If there's so much food, why are they taking it away?" Sean stared towards the distant glow of Cork Harbour, and he searched for words. Any words. None came. Finally he knelt before her. "I don't know, love." Mary nodded slowly. "I thought fathers knew everything." Sean smiled sadly. "So did I." That night, Breed found him sitting alone beneath the oak. "You haven't slept?" "No." She sat beside him. "I know what you're thinking." He looked at her. "Do you?" "You're angry." "I am." "You've never been an angry man." "I know." She took his rough hand. "Promise me something." "What?" "If anger ever tells you to do something." She paused. "Listen to your heart first." Sean squeezed her hand. "I promise." He meant it. With all his soul, he meant it. Before dawn, he walked alone to the crest of the hill overlooking the road to Cork. The city was only a faint glow against the eastern sky. Beyond it lay the harbour. Beyond the harbour, the warehouses. He stood there for a long time. Then, almost unconsciously, his eyes began tracing the routes the wagons took. The time they arrived. The places where the road narrowed. The moments when only a handful of guards remained. He wasn't making plans. Not yet. A farmer simply notices such things. A labourer remembers them. That was all. Or so he told himself. As the first rays of sunlight touched the hills of County Cork, Sean reached into his pocket. On one side lay Mary's little wooden horse. On the other, 2 grains of barley. He closed his hand around them both. One reminded him of the life he had once promised his children. The other reminded him how close that promise was to slipping beyond his reach. For the first time since the eviction, Sean realized that it was no longer hunger he feared most. It was time. Because every day he waited, Liam breathed a little weaker, Mary smiled a little less, and somewhere deep inside, the line between an honest man and a desperate father had begun, almost imperceptibly, to disappear.